The Butterfly's Dream by Curvers 314, Chapter 26, Archetypes. This wasn't her getting discouraged, animated voices in the background bleating and chipping away at her relaxation. This wasn't her becoming upset. Disinterest in the glazed pork and maple spiked sweet potatoes in front of her, pork testing the firmness of the meat as the minutes passed. This wasn't her losing hope, head in hands, eyes drooping, sigh heaving. This was just her getting tired. Yet another mission which took her and her team to the fringes of Vale, both the kingdom and the city. Whether a wild goose chase or a complete snafu, nothing had been satisfying nor as sensible as the mission where they captured Roman torchwork and single-handedly ended the dust crisis. Except that they didn't. The world turned, the tides receded, and stores were still burglarized, with or without their supposed ringleader. Ruby already knew this would be the case, or at least greatly expected it, when Osmond told him he'd send them on more tasks. She knew of his true enemy, and this continually only seemed to confirm that the crimes were due to her meddling. Now they were without a sustained lead and stuck to random guessing, far-flung hunches, and wild rumors having them traipse about cities and countryside looking for a clue. All this on top of a full semester workload. Thank all, thank all things holy, their break was coming up soon. Only a few more courses to go, and they were free, or as free as Ospen would allow them to be. Until then, she'd hold her tongue, not debasing herself to sigh over dramatically like Weiss at every opportunity. Honestly, for all the talk surrounding her sanity, she seemed to be the most well adjusted to the hunter's life. She'd been meditating with Blake more and more, which not only helped to make her up for the lack of sleep, but also to quell the unintentional spillage of the corrupted chakra. Equally busy with this very problem, I worked tirelessly trying to stem the flow, either that or complete the bridge so that Naruto could install a seal which would lessen the effects. Both answers proved elusive and incredulously like a race against time. Even with the occasional purge of his own, Naruto's frustrations kept spilling over to a general prickliness and taciturn, lashing out mainly at myself, though backscatter which also seemed to reach over to this end. It was not a good combination. Then Ruby had to get into an argument with Ospen, or vice versa. I'm not quite sure anymore. With regrets to Torchwick, Ospen had opted to keep him and his accomplice holed up in the local slammer instead of the obviously more secure dungeons there at Beacon. It was assumed that these were a leftover from before it became a school, but with the sadism of teachers like Goodwitch, sometimes I wonder if that medieval system wasn't part of the curriculum. Meanwhile, Ruby was staunch in her opinion that the jail was too insecure for the likes of someone like Neil. Austin had connections, that much she knew, so having the clout to bring them under his wings shouldn't have been a problem. It wasn't, and once she realized that it was his intention to leave them perched there like a piece of cheese on a mousetrap, well, all she knew was that she didn't approve. Call it professionalism or perhaps some twisted form of compassion. The sum of her good intentions arguments succeeded only in irking her further. Eventually, Osmond too. He had put them on probation. He called it vacation. Truth be, they probably needed it. Sage knows that I needed just to keep up with them and their often deadly antics. I would take every break I could get, and Ruby should have as well. Whatever universe spanning link we were messing with did not respond well to sleep deprivation. Sands in an hourglass or faces off of a clock. Either way, there was an imbalance in our partnership. More than a spine-tingling nervousness, it manifested into vertigo within my chamber, cracks running up the sides, and a canting of the very walls. Something needed to be done. Food fight! And there we go again with childish antics. Yet another purge, or perhaps just an avoidance of those burdensome thoughts which would have to be dealt with sooner or later. Let them be children for a little while longer. I, of all, should know just how much of that was taken from them. Meanwhile, I had work to do. Oh my gosh, that was so much fun. Panting and giggling like a hyena. For once, not alone in this attitude, Ruby collapsed against the mostly intact bench and surveyed the picture perfect catastrophe they precipitated. Jackson, Pollock with produce, and Deli as the students caught in the crossfire draped themselves over every food-caked surface. Who had even started the fight? I hadn't stuck around long enough to find out. Even then, I was only peeking in every now and then with the corner of my attention, afraid to turn away from my meddling with the cosmos like a galactic surgeon inside these two delicate universes. Maybe if I had been watching them closely, it wouldn't have happened. But just as Naruto had found out, not even observing can stop this. Stories occur whether they are written or lost to history, both inexorably leading up to the present. What if is a question of for those who don't have lives to lead. Just what is going on here? Uh-oh. Her reaction was to hide, an animal instinct no amount of training could completely eradicate from her mind. Popping behind that same bench and watching through the cracks as Glinda Goodwitch stormed in, magic ablazing and none of that compassion she displayed when it had been the two of them. She was a woman on a warpath, and as much as Ruby wanted to go out and help her friends, there was nothing she could do but to save herself. Alas, she couldn't even do that. Relief as Goodwitch failed to notice her absence was like an armful of bricks suddenly dropped, and she recognized her fatigue for the first time. Tired, so very tired. It wouldn't matter if she just took a nap here in the corner, would it? Her next class wasn't for some time. Naruto to know he'd take care of her. Only Naruto wasn't there, and there would be no one to catch her when she fell. Like a hammer hitting him in the back of the head and knocking him into consciousness. For the first time in a long time, he woke completely alert with heart racing. "You all right, Gaki?" Only then did he realize that the scalped edge of radiant thorn was no longer resting over him like a shady branch, and instead was caressing the green and red girth of his master. Arrow sending? He jumped back as if burned, knew that if the man so chose to, he would be. Jumpy there, huh? Naruto felt himself crushed under the man's square jaw expression, mumbling a quick apology. Figures. The air which Jiraiya lost was picked up by Naruto as he rose to the odd statement. What does? I guess from the start it was a girl. Naruto choked. Everything that happened hit him again. That hammer, really a wrecking ball coming through for another swing as he remembered the events before he found himself. Where was he exactly? Oh yeah, outside Tenden's apartment. Keeping watch. Again. Eh, it's not like that, you pervert, channeling that sudden fear into fervent denial, which caused his lecherous sensei to take a step back, with beefy palms imposed between the two of them. Fine, fine. Forgive me for making assumptions, given that you were outside an apartment with two ladies. And oh, completely exhausted from the night before. Folding his arms, the big man huffed, and Naruto tried not to blush at the admittedly compromising situation. There was the fact that he was outside most of the night and had been in reasonable state of mind. He could have guessed that his perverted sensei knew this. It would not have been hard to guess, as this had been his habit for a few nights now, standing guard like a gargoyle until on the other side Ruby needed to wake, and Ruby, clearly you didn't get laid. If you did, you'd be a lot less uppity. What do you want? Completely ignoring the comment, confirming it in fact, he didn't care if it wasn't important. Don't give me that attitude, brat. The solidity of the comment was enough for him to climb onto out of those marine thoughts. Not only am I your master, but I stuck my neck out for you time and again. All you can run off on some foolish and imposing crusade to get yourself killed. And this is the thanks I get. I'm sorry. The words were not enough, but they were all he could scrape together at this point. He needed to go, to move, to do something. Rui might have been in danger, and he was stuck there. Had he been paying attention, he would have noticed Jiraiya's sigh, would have observed the way he looked at him with an innate understanding. The man had been right, of course, not that he could possibly know, and yet he somehow knew. The man did, and managed to forgive him for it. Here, with only a tiny amount of bitterness still lingering in the way he tossed the packet to his pupil, Jiraiya watched him fumble with it and his weapon for but a second, still registering the change of heart. What is two different folders, rough and marked with an indescribable number of seals, orders, and nonsense codes? The blaring red stamps on top of that were unnecessary, as were the words of his sensei looking on while he scanned the cover. So number 4 and 5. He looked up from the Polaroid pics paper clip at the top and to gob at his master. My spies tell me there are Kotski's next target. What about? We were too late. The clip of response described all too well what happened to number three, Isobu, the three-tailed turtle, and his deranged container. Pity, the lot of them might have gotten along. It was another blow, this time to his chest. He was out of breath, dizzy, not capable of understanding the rest of the Sonin's words, like he missed the "we" in the man's declaration, not in a mood to share grief. The point was that he was too late. What had he been doing? Whatever it was, it hadn't been enough. In the space where he'd blinked, they'd struck, and he'd lost. No, the papers crumbled in his hand to the loud protest of the spy master who'd worked so hard to smuggle them out of Irigakuri. He took no notice, hollow gaze fixed past the man, past the window and the brick wall in the way to where the piece of ruby lay asleep, the only tangible sign that she was still all right, that she was still alive. That was the hope anyway. A desire to break down the door and check for himself was almost irresistible. He wanted to rush into the apartment and reaffirm his belief with his own two hands. If it would help, he would have gladly bludgeoned himself into unconsciousness just to look through her closed eyes and feel her steady breath. Some part of him knew that it would be pointless, though worse, detrimental to his cause, so he did none of those things. When do we leave? Turns out, in the next few minutes, long enough to say an all too quick goodbye through the windows, then to his own apartment, grab a scroll which had his combat arsenal, enough to supplement the survival gear and rations he had on person at all times, stuffing them into his jacket in the holster where once the human avatar resided for so long. Then, like dust in the attic, the gates of the village were flung open, and they were off. There was no question if they'd been authorized for this mission. I had my doubts as to whether Naruto realized this. Doubtless the legendary Sannin had given it some thought, though it was anyone's guess if he begged permission from his busty teammate or if he, like the other two, had the habit of throwing caution to the wind. Apparently, Ruby and I were not the only influences. The two hard heads in concerned with being addicted to recklessness, it seemed, unlike Naruto. The Sunny certainly recognized this flaw within him, just as he could see the irrational desperation his apprentice had taken with the safety of his fellow Jinchuriki. Normal human motivation did not justify his student's obsession, and I could tell the wise old pervert was suspicious, more concerned than mistrustful, deep concern, worry for someone he viewed as far more than an apprentice. Ah, yes, as he was watching Naruto, I was watching him steal sideways glances, reading that plagued conscience to which I knew the aliment, my advantage, that one-way mirror. Had he known that what he was staring at was staring back, things could have been clearer. No matter, I had my own grievances with the man, but would not let them come up here. He was necessary for keeping the brat safe. I had held my tongue for Naruto's benefit, and should he manage to get them both back alive, I would continue to do so. Let him choose the appropriate moment. Dying without a confession would have been worse than anything I could have done to him. Naruto, it had been so long since he heard his master's irreverent and boastful voice. It was as if this weren't Jiraiya at all, but an impostor like the ruby waiting for him back in Konoha, a stripped down copy. You're distracted. Whatever it is, forget it right now. We're going up against at least two S-class opponents, and neither of us can afford to be at anything less than our best. If you don't, it isn't just your life on the line, but mine, the other Jinchuriki, and your friends. Don't go disappointing them. That focus, the distilled attitude of no nonsense. I suppose even something so two-dimensional also served a purpose. He was right, and if he did, that advice could save his student a lot of grief. Naruto didn't need to tell him this, probably couldn't hear me anyway. He had already partitioned off this part of his mind, ridding himself of distractions and focused only on the rhythm of his breaths, the stretch of his gait, the rush of air funneled through his billowing jacket. Wakata. Even in their simplest forms, humans had that quirk of humor which was impossible to flatten, be it a bitter smirk of resignation, soft smile of contentment, or the mad grin of insanity. One of these appeared on Jiraiya's face as he sped alongside his pupil, who was as focused as the tip of the scythe which trailed behind him like a rudder. I haven't seen you use that thing yet. Any good with it? Might say that. I'll wait to see it with my own two eyes. Would he believe it even then? Some say seeing is believing. others all too content to trust in hearsay, disturbingly many ready to put their faith in a comforting lie. The monster under her bed don't care if you believe in them or not, though. Night had fallen, and they still hadn't stopped. Eventually it was now Naruto's turn to burn the midnight oil, but I doubt the kind of sleep Ruby was getting on the other side was restful. Every moment he pushed himself was another in which he had to prevent his thoughts from drifting there. It was harder for me not to think about her, for all I could do was think, banging my head against the illusionary gap, the same which now I couldn't even find. I was shut out. Fear was something I wasn't used to, one of those emotions they introduced me to. It wasn't pleasant, but at least I could see the emotion I had been inflicting on humans all these centuries. It didn't excuse their actions, but that was neither here nor there. Hopeless, I could only simmer silently and watch and listen. We're entering the land of Earth now. Be especially on your guard for Iwo Shinobi. Naruto nodded to his understanding, but I knew there was something he was not getting. The importance of that secret Jiraiya kept from him. I had not told him who his father was either, and why he of all people should be wary around the Rocknin. Don't expect them to be as understanding as Jujito, even if they have full control over their Biju. Konoha and Iwa are enemies, plain and simple. The swish of passing branches was the only answer to the sagely advice. I mean it, Naruto. This isn't like your little playdate with Kumo. Not only are Katsuki going to be extra cautious now, but there's a very good chance that Roshi and Han will be hostile to our help. Dancing around the real issue like a bed of nails couldn't have been easy. I doubted any of my kin would allow their host to turn on mine like that, but his former point held merit. Just what kind of monsters were Akatsuki going to send this time? They were down 4 of the 9 that left. Move! The already sparse trees lost one more to a gaping mouth of mud rising from below to swallow it whole. The crunch as a once proud arbor was turned into toothpicks echoed above as they drooped to the rocky terrain below. This was a mistake, as the ground which appeared a solid turned to quicksand under their feet, but they'd had little choice as the forest was quickly petering out too steep and the treacherous mountains beyond. They'd been prepared for this eventually. A flurry of movement, concealed by the crabs up ahead as was the only warning before the massive moraine perched on the hills came loose, tumbling down towards them. Not bothering to see how this student fared, the toad sage flew through handsails as the boulders rolled closer towards them. Naruto himself was already playing hopscotch with the rolling field, sprinting on top from one to the next towards the concealed enemy. Behind him the boulders were swallowed into an even deeper maw of Jiraiya's making. His foot extended in a leap, and there was a twinge of precognition which drove him to flicker out of the way. Behind him the rounded boulder he was to land on turned into a spiky mace. Apparently right in front of the rock ninja, whose hands were still fixed in the last character of his attack, that same foot which had almost been nailed lashed out to tag the man in the jaw. A cry of dismay to his right allowed him time to plant an explosive tag on the ground and get back before the man's comrade came to extract vengeance. Distance of his retreat was covered with batting projectiles, weapons out of the air, a skip in his step. The explosive note had merely delayed their second wave, and now the burgundy-clad shinobi flooded in from every fold in the mountains terrain and congregated towards him like a watershed. He flattened himself to the ground just as his master came barreling through behind him. The effect of that gargantuan man landing solidly on the hard-packed alluvium was instantaneous. He was like a human earthquake that caused all the ambushers to lose their footing and stumble as they surveyed the wrath of a god. Whispers of his name where the wind rippled through the village, scouring the stone. Knock it off! We're not here looking for a fight. Words like thunder made the rock ninja appear worried about a flash flood before a storm was raised on their own side. So what are you looking for, Jiraiya the Sanin? Come to steal more of our village secrets? With someone addressing him by name, the man relaxed his severity on the surface, keeping that dangerous tone in his reply which irritably spelled out his terms. Oh, and here was going through the trouble of returning this paperwork to you after picking it up in a brothel. I swear you find the most interesting things in those places. Don't give me that bullshit. His own guard never dropping, Naruto briefly directed his attention at the indignant speaker. You broke into our village, steal classified documents, then come waltzing over our borders like you own the place and expect us to just let you go? The woman gave a very unladylike snort and folded her arms, narrowing her gaze dangerously at the legendary shinobi. Although, tell you what, I'm actually feeling a little bit generous today, so why don't you just hand over the son of Konoha's Yellow Flash and we might call it even? In hindsight, I should have known that this would eventually happen. Routinely, I had asked myself if Naruto had known from the start that his father was the village's hero, the very man who placed me inside of him, would it have changed things? I doubt it. Now at least he looked at her, unwisely devoting the eternity of his attention. Rather than play dumb and deny the claims, he pawed over it, trying to see if he could suss out her credentials just by looking at her roughly huey hair and virtuous lavender eyes. For the Tsuchikage's granddaughter, you don't seem to be very well informed. By now, though, Jiraiya's smirk was all bravado, of which he had plenty. I'll say it once more. Don't give me that bullshit. She turned her attention to Naruto, at least giving him a look that he hadn't known in some time. Hate, disgust, for him alone, not even diffused by my burdensome weight. Rumor travels fast. Word has it that one of the great Sanin took up an apprentice, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed apprentice. There was venom dripping from the sneer she leveled at him, and he was at a loss at what to do with all the hate directed his way. The Yondaime was also your apprentice. You'd have to think us stupid as you log lovers if we couldn't read between the lines, even through the mist of Mizukage. They could see that he's his son. If Iwa's information network is so poor that they have to rely on rumors, all it took was to see the humor banished from his master's face to cement the truth in his own mind. Then you have my sincerest pity. Pity! You can have your pity and shove, but that's not why we're here for. Jiraiya bellowed, even shook the stone-faced woman, abruptly cutting off her tirade. I understand that you have very little reason to trust us, and I will not even pretend that this is something sanctioned by our Hokage, revealing that he had been aware of their negligence all along. But if nothing else, heed our warning that George and Cherokee are in danger. The Akatsuki will be coming after them any day now. We wish to help, but if you'll let us leave, we will go right now. There doesn't need to be a confrontation. You should save your strength in case those guys show up. It was a rhetorical bargain, something they had to say. Naruto already knew that, just as he knew that there was no way he'd agree to just walk away after coming this far. There'd been no rest in between Konoha and the Earth Country, no sliver of sleep where he could check and assuage his fears that Ruby was all right. The not knowing, the twitchiness and short temper which had been festering all week would not let him walk away at this point. Still not wanting to do battle, he would go through those rock men if they got in his way. Disgusting! Directed to both him and Jiraiya's words, which the woman clearly didn't believe. Her crossed arms trembled with tangible rage. Rage that was familiar to me. I'd felt its nestling as I laid siege to those human establishments. I'd felt it crawling up my throat when those same apes had tried to enslave me. It was something I knew well, yet seeing it here felt different, such that I had to agree with the hateful woman's assessment. Disgusting. That emotion was putrid and vile, spoiling what might have been a knife-like beauty, so like our own little Rose. I knew why she gave in to this feeling, the addictive nature of vengeance, especially potent against the dead man. Naruto's father, the Yondaime Hokage, has slaughtered hundreds of Iwo shinobi, and there always needed to be retribution. The endless cycle. There would be no love after this murder, though. Either he killed her or she killed him. Neither would be satisfied, and each leaving a hunger for more. Yujito recognized this. Naruto made her. Would he bother to remember this lesson now? It's revolting how you can concoct such a contemplative lie with a straight face. We might be ninja, but as a Sanin, have you no shame? Once again, the ability of humans to smile in the darkest of scenarios brought an ironic smirk to the self-proclaimed pervert's face. Sorry, babe, but no, not really. The nonchalantness or the nickname, maybe both, staggered the woman with an incensed blush. I'll fully admit that I'm dishonest, but it's the stupidity honest but it's the stupidly honest ones that you really have to worry about. The Tsuchikage's granddaughter was a jonin, a skilled one at that. Rumor had it she was next in line for the position herself. Sadly, at that all that meant little when one is so blinded by rage that they can't see the forest through the trees. In accordance with her skill, she had already drawn her chokoto and spun her around, aiming to decapitate the adversary who had somehow gotten behind her. But the long hand of the opposing weapon had already reached out to nail her right in the stomach, forcing the wind out of her sails as she crumbled down onto her stone podium. I'm sorry, wanting to spit on his frowning visage, but unable to with her body still struggling for an inward breath, she settled for memorizing his hypocritical face as it bent down to whisper in her ear, I really am, but you're in my way. Why you? Her invective reflection of the polished surface of a serrated blade, grinning peaks caressing her chin. We don't want to fight. The human ability to be so myopic always dumbfounded me. The rest of the rock ninja encouraged could see the truth well enough, but with her head almost literally in the sand, the same could not be said for their commander, who even now cursed Naruto's very being, yet another not willing to remove the blinders of hate. Please, let us help or let us go. There is no point in bloodshed. It was a statement and not a plea, and as he projected it out to the awestruck Iwanin, who looked up at him as the revenant spectre of death, he himself glanced down at his hostage. Trembling not with fear, but with continued rage, she paid no heed to the 2 points of slowly digging into either jugular as she struggled against the instinct to lunge and strangle him, only just resisting becoming a martyr. Oh, what's your name? Go to hell, you cockspawn! Her name's Korotsutsu, his master informed him, landing by his side amidst the stadium of faces torn between two powerful emotions and churning them like a stormy sea. Arguably the safest and most dangerous place in the eye of the storm. Korotsutsu, the woman wasn't there, only a mindless beast which emitted a threatening growl. I don't want to hurt you or your comrades, please. For all our sakes, recall them. Even if you weren't holding an oversized gardening tool to my neck, do you think I would be stupid enough to do that? Controlling her words, but pressing them further into his blade and drawing two small trickles from either side of her neck. You're my enemy, even if you weren't one of those tree huggers. You're his son. I hate you, and I sure as hell don't trust you. You don't even know me. The statement was sorrowful rather than contrary, expecting no more or less. My name is Uzumaki Naruto, he said before she could formulate another scathing retort. I'm the Jinchuriki for the Nine-Tailed Fox, a shinobi of Konohagakure, along with a few other things. This was no place to guess or to boast. I never considered myself anything more, not the Yellow Flash's son, and certainly not a killer. That's my reality. The fact that you hate me is your decision and no one else's. Handing the burden onto her, he did something no one within earshot expected, removing his blade from her neck and planting it in the ground so that the reforged and unsullied blade stood like a shining standard declaring his values. The incredibility only lasted a millisecond, long enough for the body to send a signal to her brain that there were no longer any points to her neck holding her back. Seals which had been hammered into her head since she was a child played themselves out with her hands before she even realized what she was doing, eyes widening with hungry opportunity just as she reached the last in the sequence and was promptly kicked in the chest. Flying through the air and once again robbed of her kill as well as her senses. It didn't register when the once rocky terrain of her homeland was overcome with a sudden deluge. Tumbling weightlessly, she might have thought back to the time her father took her to the beach, and she pictured herself flying above the waves like a seagull. I like to muse about these things sometimes. It took the mind off the bitter reality of her body slapping the water, and some 30-odd rock ninja who were crushed by the oncoming flood, which was so powerful it tore a new canyon into the landscape. Already on the high ground, Jiraiya and Naruto were spared as well, but only just as they leapt well enough into the air to put themselves above the high water mark. Landing solidly on the churning waves which concealed the suffocating corpses was difficult in itself, but their troubles weren't over, as when Naruto made to rush for the floundering Kurotsuchi, the body of water was suddenly revealed to be an ocean with dangerous wildlife out for his hide. Sharks made of the briny liquid leapt from the surface to throw themselves against him. They were just water, so he cleaved through them like they weren't even there. More were still gestating beneath the surface, but even those were not immune to him as he racked the undating scythe through the water and parted the artificial sea, dispelling the technique, if not that tide. Oh ho! So it seems that the rumors were true. Flicking the scythe to lay horizontal at his hip, dewdrops flung into the air and created a rainbow that would have been beautiful if not for the dreary setting. The brat's gotten better since we last saw him, huh, Itachi? You messed up. Like an echo, Itachi's voice was never heard except for with the shark man Kisame. You were supposed to let them face the Iwa ninja first and then capture him when they were worn out from fighting. The Blaze banter confirmed what he already knew, what we should have known all along. It had been a trap. Sorry about that, Itachi-kun. I really thought he was going to let that heartless woman kill him. The blue-skinned giant next to the Uchiha gave him a grin, showing two pearly white rows of jagged teeth. Don't get me wrong, though. I'm glad he survived. I would have been disappointed if I didn't get a chance to cut loose a little bit. Those other Jinchuriki were hardly a challenge at all. Whether this was goading or not hardly or not hardly mattered as much as any word of caution I might have given him. The mere thought that we were too late was enough to boil the blood and rattle the bars to my cage. Don't let them get to you, Naruto. The Toad Sage's greatest feature was his most underrated. Only a few still called him by his old title, Konoha's Madness, but the manic ability to switch from an aloof lech to a battle-hardened warrior saved not only his mind, but his hide and those of others. We should retreat, especially if they were telling the truth when there's no reason to stick around. Then, sometimes, he forgot to abide by his own rule and started making sense. Sometimes a little bit of madness was exactly what was needed. Do you really think they're going to let us leave? Tightening the grip on Radiant Thorn and suddenly molding the chakra inside his core, it was clear what Naruto thought the answer to that question was. Don't be a fool, Gaki. I can't protect you against the both of them. We can still make it if we push to break through right now. Being protected was the last thing he wanted. Wasn't his whole purpose to protect others? He'd failed miserably so far, and with those missteps he'd been backed against the wall. No escape awaited him when he squeezed his eyes. No consolation prize if he should run away now. In the blink of an eye, all of his goals and his purpose had been snatched from his grip. There was no denying that he is kindred to them, to me. Is it then a wonder that he would fight tooth and nail to get them back? Kisame blocked the downward slash casually with the wrapped package on his back, the stout sword which lay within squirming to be led out to play. It would not have to wait long. Once its covered form was used to bludgeon the solid clone, another lightning-fast strike sparked along the incredible length from a new angle, a new clone. The friction between weapons charred the gauzy wrap on the weapon, jerking it up for a split-second defense. The tattered remains were shred like a skin to unveil the horrid surface of living scales underneath. My, that's mighty kind of you to indulge me, the blue-skinned man snarked imperturbably despite the quivering interlock of blades. Try to make it last at least a bit longer than the others, huh? Jaw clenched so he wouldn't bite his tongue. Naruto vaulted backwards when it was clear he was losing the battle of attrition to the man who was known as the Tailless Biju, not before he felt the parting gift in the form of the explosive tag on the other side of Kisame's massive cleaver, which, like the other time, gave him a moment of respite before he was harshed again. Ha ha! This just keeps getting more and more interesting, pointed the smile beaming with the compliments, all the while hammering away at Naruto's defenses, which were slipping every time the scaly sword slammed against him. Normally, Samihara sucks the chakra right out of those tags, but you've made something that neglects that. Maybe you can tell me how it works before we extract the QB from your seal. Neither of those things is happening. It was with admirable determination that he announced this, but all the effort in the world sometimes wasn't enough but to delay the inevitable. Naruto was getting out-dueled, if only because the man had both years of experience and about twice the weight on him. Putting up an admirable show wasn't good enough, and he could only rely on Jiraiya to keep Itachi off his back. He held one advantage though. Kisame might have had massive chakra reserves, but he was no Jinchuriki. Let me. Nary a pause, so when I spoke to him this time, he formed a single hand seal, and the entire surface of the water was covered with an orange and black algal bloom. The rapid fire pops of clones being ravaged left and right proved enough distraction for him to scoot aside and allow me room to work. The next second saw Kisame right in our face, the scale, the tip of Samehada staring us down like the rocks at the bottom of a cliff. Not even bothering with the other clones, he charged straight for us like the single-minded predator that he is. The foxes are predators too, and where the direct route might fail, we don't mind getting our paws dirty. Sandaled feet got wet as Naruto's whole body sunk under the weight of the blow. Radiant Thorn didn't so much as flex, but the same could not be said for Naruto's arm, which bowed against his will. Kisame already knew the moment when Naruto flashed out of the sticky situation and right into his crackling backhand. Another flicker, another deflection. There was no question that Naruto was faster, more adept at the Shunshin technique, but those facts mattered little to Kisame, who, while being nearly twice the weight of a normal man, was quick as a whip to reverse the direction of his blade and intercept every surprise attack. He was even ready when Naruto backed off again, and a gang of his clones sprung from the water like a living bear trap on the fishman. The jaws came up too close around him and stopped. Every one of the blond clones were encased in clear marbles of water, perfectly preserving that moment of surprise like an insect mounting in uh, acrylic. Ah, silly boy, don't you understand that I know everything that's happening in and on top of the water? The sea is my domain. This declaration was accompanied by him whacking the entrapped clone like he was a slugger at a batting cage. The human-sized spheres tumbling at him at worrying velocities. It was a quick and simple matter to dispel them, the contained cells collapsing in on themselves without something solid to prop them up. But through this vapor screen the shark swam, launching out once again to tear into his flesh. Kisame's blade wasn't sharp, so when it first smashed into him, he was merely driven back, breathless, clinging on and digging in for dear life as he tried to swallow it down. Next would come the tear, with but a flick of the wrist. Samehada's barbed scales would flay all the flesh off his bones. Nothing he could do well would stop that from happening. The shark man's mouth splitting into a wide grin as he smelled fresh blood in the water. With a carelessness he strolled over to the floating corpse and plucked it out of the surface by a scrape of its shredded jacket. Come on, brat, quit playing dead. I know something like that's not enough to take down someone like you. I had to hold back enough to keep you alive for the unsealing anyway. But even as he said those words, a worried frown trod its way over his confident smirk. The body he held in his hands wasn't breathing, but it was sizzling. Shit! This explosion was roughly 10 times the previous, and would have done some lasting damage had Kisame not interposed a wall of water between him and it. Still, water is non-compressible, and I have no doubt that it rattled the bones in his hands, pressed up to maintain the shield. What the hell was that? The time spent watching over pseudo Ruby did not serve to further our goals with figuring out either the trick to the universal connection nor the horizon, but that was not to say that it bore no fruit. Somehow the copy which had filtered into our world was more substantial than a clone, more durable and longer lasting. There was an additional component which set it aside from the shadow clones Naruto used on a daily basis. Flesh and blood. That is what we tried to recreate and managed to succeed, though treading dangerously close to the abominations perpetrated by the renegade Sanin Orochimaru. We never went that far. We were never went that last unforgivable step. It was only ever a shell meant to be inhabited, or in this case, to be blown up as a distraction, though it also takes a lot of concentration and time, not something normally suited for a battle where life and death rested only a heartbeat away, but that was a precondition for normal people, and Naruto was anything but normal. He had me to do the hard part for him. Don't think that'll save you, kid. Clearly anticipating for the scythe to cleave through his wall like a wet sheaf. It is safe to say that Kisame wasn't prepared to stagger back under the unprecedented force. Voice taking the hit more than body, he was quick to regain his footing and press back, suddenly keen to make a more serious approach to his duel. Sugoi, you've gotten even stronger since we started. It's a good thing we decided to go after you now. You would have actually been a pain in the ass later, but a foot proportional to his massive body lashed out and connected with its target, breaking the deadlock and sending the crescent blade back into the sky. You're 100 years too early to face me. Madness garners respect. It's a kind of superpower. You might be the most bloodthirsty and terrifying killer out there, bar none, and yet you still fear the possibility that there's someone stronger, and that paranoia drives you to the edge of madness, but never over it, because once you are over it, you don't care, and when you don't care, you can do anything. Sorry. So when Kisame's kick failed to crumble the boy half his size, that unknown, that possibility of anything and the crazed grin to go with it reared its ugly head with an equally disturbing smile. I think you've got the wrong person. I dare do all it is to become a human, to become a man. Who dares more is none. And above us, a hand reached out to pluck that crescent moon blade from the sky. Man and weapon casting a shadow, which was beautiful as well as terrifying. Despite this, Kisame was obviously more perplexed than anxious, only because he hadn't figured out the one at the end of his kick wasn't an ordinary clone, which would vanish with a single tap. This was me. Now, Naruto! My scream was more out of eagerness than concern, seeing that S-rank killer turn a lighter shade of blue for just a moment when he did realize her sure eyes no longer held him captive, but crimson, only for a moment, a brief moment stretched longer as a radiant thorn sunk all of the fingernails within the skin of Samihada at the extent of all his chakra, then strength dumped into that blow. Your tricks are getting old. Anger surpassed whatever shock was involved with the damage to his blade, but we weren't done. This is one of mine. Impossible as it is to imagine, when his precious blade was nicked, it seems Kisame actually forgot about the clawed hands digging into his calf. He wouldn't ignore the mouth of teeth as they tore into his kneecap, though. Couldn't forget the vicious face of a fox as it severed his Achilles tendon. Gah! What in the hell? This was my body. At least it was temporarily, and I could do anything, would do anything to win, but it never seemed to be enough. So close. Through trial and error, we'd stumbled upon this technique, a means to create a hollow shell, a vessel. I had learned the human corpse as well as my own, so that with a concentrated effort I might mold the perfect body, not for myself, not for my own whims. If we had no luck traveling there, why not bring her here? That was the original inspiration drawn from the not Ruby. So close. Alas, now so far, with Ruby completely unconscious on the other side, both directions appeared barred in the colorless veil. I was too late. Why had I wasted all that time in silence? What had all the effort been for if life was just going to take it all away? Never before had I known disappointment. Never before had I known failure such as this. I had failed them. That was a pain far worse than the sword repeatedly tearing into my back, trying to make me let him go, let it rip. The pain of this animated flesh was fleeting. It was nothing compared to the pain of losing her yet again. This wasn't my body. This wasn't my soul. For me, it was all expendable, all to save that brilliant spirit and ones like it. Die, you mangy rat! Leave him be! Admirably that he should fight for me, even if it was just a fleshy puppet. Gods, did it hurt though? It was hazy what happened from there as my consciousness flittered between the me clone and that Windows watch behind Naruto's eyes. It was disconcerting, a little nauseating even. I suppose that's to be expected when you're looking at your own body get turned into chum. I do know that Naruto easily snuck past Kisame's distracted flailing, sinking a deep gash into his thigh. For his trouble that Katsuki answered with one of his own, managing a crude wound on Naruto's shoulder. I gave up whatever control I had left in that disintegrated clone and focused on healing Naruto and restoring his chakra. Those two fleshy clones nearly drained him, even if most of their energy came from me. It only does it to it not only does it take an extreme concentration to arrange something as complex as the nervous system, it takes an almost infinite amount of energy to create matter from nothing and sustain it for a few seconds, let alone a few minutes. If it would give us the opportunity we needed, it would be worth all of it. His blood spilled with my potent chakra. Naruto flew at Kisame in a literal sense, jettisoning off the surface with a spray of salt water behind him.
The man was just that much lower with the damage of his left leg, staggering after the human cannonball impacted him and slowly succumbing to the rapid attrition which followed. It looked like Naruto finally had the upper hand. That, of course, is when everything took another right turn. Naruto-kun. Those words were a cold hand from the past, Bravo snagging him in his advance. He knew the voice, and if Itachi was speaking to him so casually, that meant Jiraiya! He could see the man only as the red and green I've seen stuck onto a rocky outcrop like a piece of discarded gum. Couldn't tell if he was breathing, not even if he was still alive. If Itachi was standing here before him, it wasn't likely. As you can see, Jiraiya-sama won't be able to help you any longer. I suggest you come with us quietly. If you do, we might even spare that Iwa Konoichi. Even if it were the truth, that was but a tiny salve in the giant bucket of festering shit this turned into. Since it began, Kurotsuchi hadn't even crossed her mind, and her sparring would be would be of little consolation if this was truly the end. I would do my best to prevent that, but could not help those undermining doubts from creeping in, wondering what our possible demise would do to the bond. It was not something any of us had dared contemplate before. Then I heard him whisper something so small that I thought it might have just been an echo of one of his memories wandering these lonely hallways. He came to me in my cage, suggesting that he might tear off the seal which kept me bound, a last resort for someone at the end of his rope. How long ago would this have pleased me? It had been my sole desire to be in this exact situation, to have the one who held the shackles on their knees in front of me. When had it ceased to be my dream? I could not remember, but no longer was Naruto's life an acceptable price to pay. I sought another option, but what was there? Things were already moving as fast as slipping so far out of control, but putting on the brakes only served to create that noxious smell of burning rubber which clouded thoughts and battered at the inside of the skull. Or maybe there was something else. What are you doing in here? Naruto and I found ourselves in the infatuating presence of that prodigal Uchiha, realizing that he must have made eye contact through the reflection in the water, and thus gained access to my seal. I would have feasted on his flesh if only those bars hadn't been in my way. In that moment of rage, I dare say that I no longer cared what toll was owed so long as I could rip his throat out with my own two paws. And while I snapped futilely at my bonds, he had only eyes for Naruto, who had been so taken aback by the intrusion that he had no time to avert his gaze. I don't remember if I snarled or cried out his name when he was sucked into that damning illusion of the Monkey Kill Sharingan, which with but a glance tested the very limits of a human's mind, took him to a world controlled entirely by the Uchiha, where time itself bowed down to his whims, and, for better or worse, I went along for the ride. "It's good to see you again, Naruto-kun." This was not the most grounding of statements for a world which felt upside down and inside out. Feelings of disorientation and inversion of every sense, including color, made it impossible for me to find my own place amongst this imaginary wasteland. Naruto was easy enough to spot, as all the light seemed to bend towards him and Itachi. "You've grown quite a bit since I last saw you." It had indeed been an eventful 3 years. Somehow I had the distinct feeling that he was talking about time even further back than that, though. In the memories I watched like cinema, there was occasionally a raven which poked its head into a juvenile Naruto's life every now and then. Before I never gave it a second thought, as the same bird followed Ruby when she wandered alone in the forest. Only now do I realize that the two were different. "Let me go, Itachi!" Wrist and ankles tightly bound to a cross, and his tormentor but a stone's throw away, did not diminish Naruto Uzumaki's fortitude. If anything, it seemed to focus it. If only he could surmount this obstacle, he could get away, to home, to his master, to his fellow Jinchuriki, to Ruby. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Naruto-kun." There was nothing apologetic about that flat tone, and even less about the ninjato which he clutched innocently in his right hand. "Nothing you can do in here can really hurt me," Naruto pointed out, equally callously. "And when I get out, I will tear you to shreds." His pacifistic ideals suspended, that was promise that I was more than willing to back him up on. "We shall see." He approached the crucifix. "I have 24 hours to test that theory." The blade plunged into Naruto's gut, and he did not cry out. merely sucked down air through his flaring nostrils as teeth clenched that they might break, but would not give in to the pain. Then it twisted, and he had no choice in the matter. The blade carved so slowly across his stomach that even detached as I was, there was a physical empathy which I could only imagine was but a fraction of the real thing, and it lasted for hours, nay, days. The screams of the dying had never disturbed me before this day, and I tried to remember a time where they did not, but everything was overridden by that moan which rent through the eldritch world. At least it was over. Nothing was left of the gaping wounds, which left entrails dangling like the hangman's rope. A blink of the eye and they were healed, restored to the way things were, if not normal. 23 hours, 59 minutes to go. The statement spoke as if relating the weather. To me, it was a knife coming to cut the invisible strings which bound us together. I could feel Naruto slipping away, and could only turn that knife inwards to berate my hopelessness. I could not bear to watch the blade rise again, but I also could not look away, physically unable, but also bearing the grim duty of being the record keeper to this tragic saga. It came down to the next cut. In that world of nothingness, the only sounds were the illusion of breathing, the blade sliding over flesh, and the screams. So when following that familiar noise of metal meeting flesh, there was an unearthly silence. It was impossible not to notice. Itachi paused in his advance to look down to the ground, where his severed arm still clutched the hilt of his weapon as it stuck out of the ground like a grave marker. Only his pinwheel eyes expressed the incredulity as he looked up at Naruto for a brief moment, and then his head was separated from his body, which dissolved into a murder of crows. From the start it had been an illusion. We had known this all along, just as we knew not to stare the man directly in the eyes to avoid falling into the world of Tsukiyomi, but somewhere along the lines imagination had fallen away and left only the stark reality that neither of us were getting out of here alive. So which one was it that now confronted us? That sly grin and welcoming eyes which we had dreamt of for so long had become an ancient legend, and yet to see it here in an illusionary world created for the sole purpose of torture, there was no denying its veracity. Ruby cast back her crimson cowl, and smiled up at her martyr on the cross. Crescent rose fleshing out her slender presence. A breeze tousled that cloak, picking up rose petals that were never there before, and wiping away the tears from his eyes. I found you. End of chapter 26.